All right. It is the last week, the last new material for the Gothic period, and it is a bit of a hodgepodge because that's kind of what Gothic is. I have to say that this is also, these last screencasts here are my last ones for the semester, and I am not going to miss this. Not the way I like to teach. Okay. We're going to start in France, look at the 14th century in France. We are going to then move to England, look at later Gothic developments in England, and then we're going to take a look at Italian and Central European, the kind of Gothic of the Holy Roman Empire, to conclude. And I'm not in presentation mode. Okay, here we go. Okay, so we start to see in the 14th century manuscript illumination, this highly expert skill that initially was the realm of monks. We begin to see it shift to professional workshops in Paris and other major cities. So these are workshops who are taking clients, working more the way artists do today. And Jean Pucelle is a Paris manuscript illuminator who signed his work. And what we begin to see, that's evidence in this breviary here, are fully modeled figures in three-dimensional architectural settings. There's an interest in the natural world as well. If we see these, very specific, highly detailed birds, monkeys here. Look at this very early, this is kind of proto-scientific perspective as well in this work. Jean Pucelle made one of the most famous books of hours. Remember, these are personalized prayer books that the very wealthy commissioned to emulate monastic prayer books. And so these were prayer books for lay people. And this was, the Hours of Jean Dubrow were commissioned by Charles IV to give to his wife. They were married in 1325 and Charles died in 1328. So we have a pretty specific dating here for this book. And we see a kind of modified grisaille technique, so that grayscale in the figures here, these ink washes, and then Pucelle and his workshop, they go back in to add some flesh tones and some light background. You can see in the photo above how tiny this book is. And there are scenes from the life of the Virgin and the Passion of Christ juxtaposed throughout this prayer book. And so here, if we look down below, we have on the left the betrayal of Christ. This is one of the scenes that leads up to his resurrection, one of the scenes of the Passion. And then we have the Annunciation on the right. This is where the angel Gabriel appears to Mary to tell her that she is to bear the Son of God. And these, this juxtaposition, it's not one that we've encountered yet in medieval typology, but it shows us that even in this most joyous scene, the Annunciation on the right, it foreshadows the torture, the agony of the death of Christ that we see play out here in the left-hand scene. And there's this little detail on the Annunciation page that I just love. I love these kind of scenes within scenes in medieval books. And what we have here is this historiated initial. So not just illuminated, but this is when an initial actually has a narrative scene within it. We see a tiny figure holding a book, kneeling, wearing a crown. This is the owner of the book. This is Queen Jeanne d'Avreux wearing her crown. And as you might guess, the book that she holds is her personal prayer book, is her book of hours. We also see other scenes down below, the main scenes, that show us very secular images that don't really seem to fit. Musicians and monkeys, children playing different games. this mix of religious and secular images, even grotesque images amongst the foliate borders, this really takes off in the late Middle Ages. We see it from French workshops, and we also see it more so in English books as well. And I think this is a fantastic example of that. Here we see a work by actually a female artist, Richard and Jean de Montbaston. They were a husband and wife team of illuminators who worked, they had a workshop at the University of Paris, one of the oldest universities in Europe. And this is an illustration in the margin of one of the first secular novels in Europe called The Romance of the Rose. And as the title here suggests, we see a nun here leading a monk by his exposed penis. And you can see it's been a little bit scratched out. Later, more prudish readers did not care for that addition. And yeah, it's, you know, we tend to think of medieval Europe as a very restrictive society, very tight-laced. And it was. There were very powerful institutions like the church, like the aristocracy that dictated every element of life. But what we begin to see in the later Middle Ages is that we find in the margins of art images that even make a modern artist today, a modern audience today blush, and they reveal the rebellions in medieval society, these subversive desires that appear along the margins. And it's not just the margins of books, but it's the margins of architecture. Think about the gargoyles. Think about these demons that are included in the nooks and crannies of architectural sculpture as well. And I think that this is particularly powerful here because it's perhaps the first example in Western art where we have a female artist subverting sexual roles in the depiction of male desire and the domination over her sex. I think that this is a really fascinating artifact that we have here. We also begin to see, you know, this really, I think in many ways, this really leads us towards these Renaissance ideas. You know, in the Renaissance, we talk a lot about the changing concept of the artist. Artists begin to sign their works. They begin to be seen as intellectuals, but this really has roots in the late Middle Ages. Matthew Parris was an English monk and an artist who includes himself in this manuscript page here. We see him down below, again, on the margin, and actually outside of the margin here, the framing device around the Virgin and Child, where he is including himself. I also think it's really interesting that he labels himself, and we see brother Fra Matthias Parris. So he's signing his work essentially, but he's also depicting himself monochromatically, as opposed to the color portrait of the Virgin and Child. He's also not really shown as an artist. There's no tools of his trade. He's really shown as the guise of a monk. And Matthew Parris is really on the cusp between the medieval and the Renaissance worlds. From art that is being produced primarily in a monastic realm to this new shift to the professional urban craftsman and the court painter. He's literally on the edge of his own creation. We're not yet seeing fully fleshed out artist self-portraits as we do in the Renaissance. All right, let's go back to Jean Dubrow here. Sorry for the bouncing around. I kind of wanted to do all of the manuscripts together, but let's go back to Jean. Powerful patron, Queen of France in the early 14th century. And here we see another key theme in the Gothic era, the importance of the Virgin Mary in Gothic religious practices. Jeanne Dubrow, as queen, she donated this work to Saint-Denis. Remember that close royal connection here at Saint-Denis. The base of this is a kind of tiny tabletop sculpture. We see enameled scenes of the Passion of Christ. So again, this kind of combination of tender, joyous moment between mother and child at the top, but then remembering the purpose of Christ, remembering the violence and the death that is to come. And we see a very family moment at the top. Mary is very regal, queen-like. This is that international Gothic style, these, kind of gracefully curving figures, very tall, thin, elegant. And she originally had a golden crown with jewels set upon her head. And she also carries, there's this cute little baby moment here, baby Jesus kind of reaching up to grab his mother's face. And then in her right hand, we see that she has a rock crystal. This is a jeweled crystal in the shape of a fleur-de-lis, a national symbol of French monarchy. And this actually is a reliquary. So this whole sculpture is a reliquary, and embedded in that fleur-de-lis is a tiny, tiny piece of the Virgin's hair.